The morning sun cast long shadows across Miller's diner as 5 leather-clad bikers pulled into the parking lot, their motorcycles rumbling like distant thunder. Through the window, old Tom Henderson sat quietly at his usual corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup, all 96 years of him perfectly still as he watched them enter. The lead biker, a giant of a man with a gray beard down to his chest, stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Tom. The other 4 bikers crowded behind him, their faces hidden behind dark glasses and thick beards. The diner fell silent, only the soft crackle of bacon on the grill and the quiet hum of the ceiling fans remained. Tom didn't move. His blue eyes, still sharp despite his age, stayed fixed on the group. His World War II veteran's cap sat proudly on his silver hair, its pins and medals gleaming in the morning light. The lead biker took one heavy step forward. Then another. His boots echoed against the linoleum floor as he approached Tom's booth. Behind the counter, Betty the waitress reached for the phone, her hand trembling. That's when Tom did something unexpected. With movements that belied his age, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his own phone. The bikers tensed, but Tom simply smiled, a knowing, calm smile that seemed to hold secrets from nearly a century of life. He dialed a number from memory, never breaking eye contact with the lead biker. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. Then something extraordinary happened. A phone started ringing inside the diner. But it wasn't Betty's phone at the counter. It wasn't coming from any of the frightened customers who had pressed themselves against the walls. The ringing was coming from the lead biker's jacket pocket. The big man's hands started shaking as he reached for his phone. His face, previously set in stone, began to crumble like an old photograph burning at the edges. The other bikers looked at each other, confusion clear even behind their sunglasses. Tom's voice, strong and clear despite his age, cut through the tension like a knife through butter. I've been waiting 60 years to return something to you, son. The lead biker removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were suddenly wet with tears. But before anyone could understand what was happening, before the mystery of the phone call and Tom's words could be explained, the biker did something that left everyone in the diner frozen in disbelief. He fell to his knees. And that's when the real story began, a tale that would change not just that morning in Miller's diner, but the lives of everyone present, forever. Earlier that morning, Tom Henderson woke up just as he had for the past 70 years, at exactly 5:30 a.m., without an alarm. The small bedroom of his one-story house was filled with pre-dawn shadows, but his mind was already clear and alert. He sat on the edge of his bed, his joints protesting quietly as they had for the past few decades. On his bedside table sat 3 things: a black and white photograph of a young woman with a bright smile, a small wooden box with worn edges, and his veteran's cap. His eyes lingered on the photo of Mary, his wife of 52 years, gone now for almost a decade. "Morning, sweetheart," he whispered, just as he did every day. Tom's morning routine was something you could set your watch by. He made his bed with military precision, corners tucked tight enough to bounce a quarter off. His clothes for the day were already laid out: pressed khaki pants, a clean white shirt, and his comfortable but well-polished brown shoes. No matter his age, Tom believed in starting each day looking your best. As he buttoned his shirt, his eyes caught his reflection in the mirror. Time had left its mark, his once black hair now silver, his face lined with years of experience, but his blue eyes still held that same sparkle from his youth. The doctors called him a medical miracle, still living independently at 96, his mind sharp as ever. In his small kitchen, Tom went through the motions of making breakfast. 1 egg, 2 pieces of toast, a small glass of orange juice. As his coffee brewed, he looked out his kitchen window at the quiet street of his small town. He'd lived here since returning from the war, raised his family here, watched the town grow and change around him. The morning paper lay on his front porch, just as it had every day for the past 50 years. Tom picked it up, nodding to Mrs. Johnson next door as she walked her little dog. She waved back enthusiastically. Everyone in town knew Tom. To the younger folks, he was living history. To his contemporaries, those few who remained, he was a reminder of their shared past. But today felt different somehow. As Tom sat in his favorite armchair, coffee in hand, his eyes kept drifting to that small wooden box in his bedroom. For 60 years, it had held something precious, something that needed to be returned. He'd promised himself he would do it someday, and lately, that promise had been weighing heavier on his conscience. Tom finished his coffee and walked back to his bedroom. He opened the box carefully, looking at its contents for the 1000th time. Inside lay a silver pocket watch, its surface scratched but still beautiful. The inscription on the back was worn but readable, "To my son, James. May time always lead you home." His hands trembled slightly as he closed the box and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He'd been tracking the owner's son for years through various contacts, following leads that always seemed to go cold. Until last week, when a phone call brought unexpected news. They were coming through town today, a group of bikers on their way to a rally. Among them would be the man he'd been looking for. Tom placed his veteran's cap on his head, checked his reflection one final time, and grabbed his jacket. It was time for his daily breakfast at Miller's Diner. But today wasn't just another morning routine. Today, after 60 years, he would finally keep his promise to a dying friend on a battlefield half a world away. As he locked his front door, Tom's neighbor called out, "Have a good day, Mr. Henderson." Tom smiled, knowing that today would be anything but ordinary. "Every day above ground is a good day," he called back, his standard response. But in his pocket, the wooden box felt heavy with 6 decades of waiting, and his heart beat a little faster with anticipation of what was to come. The rumble of motorcycles first caught everyone's attention about a mile outside of town. In Miller's Diner, the regular breakfast crowd paused mid-conversation, forks hovering over plates of eggs and pancakes. Betty, who'd been working the morning shift for 20 years, glanced up from refilling coffee cups. The sound grew louder, 5 distinct engines harmonizing in a deep growl that echoed off the small town's buildings. They appeared first as dark shapes in the morning sun, then details emerged, gleaming chrome, leather vests, and massive bikes that looked like they could tell stories from every state in the country. The bikers pulled into the diner's parking lot in perfect formation, like a well-rehearsed dance. Their leader, the largest of the group, rode a classic Harley with custom paintwork that caught the sunlight. Behind him, 4 others parked in a neat row, their bikes forming an impressive line of power and steel. Inside the diner, conversations died down to whispers. Mrs. Peterson clutched her purse closer, and old Bill Wilson at the counter suddenly found his coffee extremely interesting. The morning regulars weren't used to such visitors, their small town was off the main highway, and strangers, especially ones that looked like these, were rare. The leader took off his helmet, revealing a face weathered by years on the road. His gray beard was neatly trimmed despite its length, and his leather vest bore patches from dozens of rallies across the country. The others followed suit, each of them tall, broad-shouldered, their arms covered in faded tattoos that peeked out from beneath their leather jackets. As they walked toward the diner's entrance, Betty noticed something unusual. These men didn't swagger or strut like troublemakers. They moved with a kind of quiet purpose, their boots making solid sounds against the pavement. The youngest among them held the door for an elderly couple leaving the diner, nodding respectfully as they passed. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, bringing with them the smell of leather and open road. The diner's fluorescent lights revealed what the morning sun had hidden. Their leather vests weren't just covered in rally patches, but also military insignias and veteran support ribbons. They scanned the diner slowly, not in a threatening way, but as if looking for someone specific. The leader's eyes moved from table to table until they landed on Tom's corner booth. Something flickered across his face, recognition, uncertainty, maybe even fear. One of the other bikers, a man with silver streaks in his dark beard, whispered something to their leader. The big man nodded slowly, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The group stood there, just inside the entrance, creating a tableau that would be remembered in town gossip for years to come: 5 intimidating bikers, frozen in place by the sight of one elderly veteran. The regular customers watched the scene unfold with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Betty's hand hovered near the phone, ready to call the police if needed. But Tom Henderson sat calmly in his booth, seemingly unaffected by the tension his presence had created. The lead biker took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for battle. But before he could take another step, Tom reached for his phone, setting in motion events that would reveal how deeply the past could reach into the present, and how some promises refused to be forgotten. In the silence that followed, even the usual morning sounds of the diner seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The story of that morning would be told and retold in their small town for generations to come, but none of the tellings would ever quite capture the electric tension of that moment, when past and present collided in Miller's diner. As Tom sat in his booth, watching the lead biker's reaction, his mind drifted back to a different time, to a muddy field in Korea, 1953. The rain had been falling for days, turning everything into a sea of brown and gray. He remembered the young soldier who'd fought beside him, James Parker, barely 22 but with eyes that had seen too much. They'd been pinned down that day, the enemy fire so heavy you couldn't raise your head without risking it getting taken off. James had pulled out his silver pocket watch, the one his father had given him before he shipped out. "My boy's turning 5 today," he'd said, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "Promised I'd be home for his next birthday." Tom's hands tightened around his coffee cup as the memories washed over him. He remembered how James had saved his life that day, pushing him into a shallow trench seconds before a grenade exploded where he'd been standing. The same blast that had given Tom the slight limp he still carried had hit James much worse. In those final moments, James had pressed the pocket watch into Tom's hands. "Find my boy," he'd whispered through blood-stained lips. "Tell him his old man never broke a promise, just took a little longer to keep it." Those were his last words. For 60 years, Tom had carried both the watch and the promise. He'd searched for James's son whenever he could, following leads that went nowhere. The boy had been moved around after his father's death, bounced between relatives. The trail had gone cold so many times that Tom had almost given up hope. Then last week, a call from his old army buddy who kept tabs on veteran motorcycle groups had given him the lead he'd been waiting for. James Parker Jr., now in his late 60s, was leading a group of veteran bikers across the country. They'd be passing through town on their way to a rally. Tom looked at the lead biker now, really looked at him. Behind the gray beard and weathered face, he could see traces of his old friend. The same set of the jaw, the same way of standing. James Parker Jr. had grown up to be the spitting image of his father, though he'd never had the chance to know it. The wooden box felt heavy in Tom's pocket, carrying not just a silver watch, but 60 years of memories, guilt, and hope. He'd practiced this moment in his head countless times over the decades, imagining how he would explain everything. But now that the moment had actually arrived, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. In his mind, Tom could still hear the sounds of that distant battlefield, could still feel the weight of his friend dying in his arms. But he also remembered the promise, not just to deliver the watch, but to make sure James's son knew his father had been a hero, that his last thoughts had been of his little boy's birthday. The diner around him faded away as the memories took hold. Every sleepless night spent wondering if he'd ever find James's son, every dead end that had left him discouraged but never defeated, every small clue that had kept him searching, it had all led to this moment. Tom's hands were steady as he reached for his phone. Despite his age, despite the weight of the years and the memories, he knew exactly what he had to do. The time had finally come to fulfill a promise made in blood and mud over half a century ago, to bridge the gap between a father's love and a son who had grown up without it. In the distance, he could almost hear James's voice, tell him his old man never broke a promise. Tom intended to do exactly that, even if it had taken 60 years to get here. The ringing of the phone in the lead biker's pocket seemed to echo through Miller's diner like a church bell. James Parker Jr.'s hands shook as he pulled out his phone, staring at the unfamiliar number on the screen. His eyes, wide with disbelief, never left Tom's face as he slowly raised the phone to his ear. "Hello?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Look inside your father's silver pocket watch," Tom said into his own phone, his voice carrying clearly across the diner. "The one you thought was lost forever. The inscription isn't just on the back." The other bikers moved closer to their leader, forming a protective circle. One of them, a man with stark white hair, placed a steadying hand on James Jr.'s shoulder. The big man's legs seemed to give way, and he sank into the nearest booth, his leather creaking against the vinyl seats. "How do you?" James Jr. started, then stopped. "I never even saw my father's watch. It was lost when he..." His voice cracked with emotion. Tom's voice remained steady as he spoke into the phone, though his eyes grew misty. "The inside of the case has another message. Your father had it engraved the day before he shipped out. He wanted you to see it on your 5th birthday." James Jr. lowered his phone, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The other customers in the diner sat frozen, witnesses to a moment they didn't quite understand but knew was important. Betty stood behind the counter, coffee pot forgotten in her hand, as she watched the scene unfold. Tom reached slowly into his jacket pocket and withdrew the wooden box. Its surface was smooth from decades of handling, the wood dark with age. With careful movements, he opened it and removed the silver pocket watch. 60 years of careful preservation had kept it in remarkably good condition. He held it out toward James Jr., who stared at it as if it might disappear. "Your father's last words were about you," Tom said softly. "About keeping his promise to come home for your birthday." The big biker moved with surprising gentleness as he took the watch. His hands, covered in faded tattoos and marked by years of hard work, cradled it like it was made of glass. He opened the case with trembling fingers, and a small piece of paper fluttered to the table. Time seemed to stop as James Jr. picked up the paper. It was a photograph, worn and creased, of a smiling young boy blowing out birthday candles. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Jimmy's 4th birthday, his last before I ship out. I'll be there for the next one, son. Love, Dad." Inside the watch's case, nearly hidden by years of tarnish, were engraved words that made the tough biker leader break down completely. "Time will bring me home to you, son. A father's love never ends." The other bikers gathered closer, their own eyes glistening as they watched their leader confront a past he'd thought was lost forever. The diner remained silent except for the soft sounds of James Jr.'s tears and the gentle ticking of a watch that had waited 60 years to complete its journey home. Betty quietly began brewing a fresh pot of coffee. She knew that this morning would require more than just a quick cup. This morning would need time for stories to be told, for questions to be answered, for 6 decades of waiting to finally come to an end. And in his usual booth, Tom Henderson sat back, watching as a promise made in war was finally kept in peace. The weight of 60 years lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some promises, no matter how long delayed, were always meant to be kept. The morning crowd at Miller's diner had thinned out, leaving just Tom, the bikers, and a few curious regulars who couldn't bring themselves to leave. Betty kept the coffee flowing as Tom began to share the story he'd held onto for 60 years. "Your father and I were more than just soldiers together," Tom explained, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "We were like brothers. We'd promised each other that if anything happened, we'd look after each other's families. James Jr. held the pocket watch in his massive hands, occasionally running his thumb over its worn surface. His fellow bikers sat in the surrounding booths, creating a protective circle around this moment of vulnerability. That last morning, Tom continued, your father couldn't stop talking about you. He pulled out that watch every few minutes, showing everyone your picture inside. My boy's turning 5 today, he kept saying. He had plans for when he got home, teaching you to fish, building you a treehouse. The lead biker's shoulders shook slightly. One of his companions, the white-haired man, spoke up. Jim never talks about his father. All these years riding together, all he ever said was that he died in Korea when Jim was little. Tom nodded slowly. The attack came just before noon. Your father, he saved my life. Pushed me into a trench when he saw the grenade. He took the worst of it. Tom's hand unconsciously moved to his leg, where the old injury still ached on cold mornings. In his last moments, he wasn't thinking about himself. All he could talk about was you, and that promised birthday. He made me swear I'd find you, tell you about him, give you his watch. Tom's voice grew softer. But when I got home, you and your mother had moved. Nobody knew where. James Jr. looked up, his eyes red. Mom, she couldn't handle it. We moved around a lot, stayed with different relatives. She never talked about Dad. Never even showed me a picture. He paused, studying the photo from the watch. This is the first time I've seen what he looked like. The diner fell silent as the weight of that statement sank in. 6 decades of not knowing, of missing connections, of a son growing up without even knowing his father's face. I never stopped looking, Tom said. Every lead, every possibility. I had friends in veteran groups across the country keeping an eye out. Last week, one of them called. Said a biker group led by a James Parker Jr. was passing through town. When he described you. Tom smiled softly. You look just like him. The other bikers exchanged glances. They'd known their leader as a tough man, respected in their community, always ready to help fellow veterans. Now they were seeing another side of him, the 5-year-old boy who never got to celebrate that birthday with his father. We're not just a motorcycle club, the white-haired biker explained to Tom. We're all veterans, all of us carrying something from our service days. Jim here, he's been helping veterans' kids for years. Organizing support groups, raising money for education. Tom's eyes brightened. Your father would be proud. He always said the measure of a man was how he helped others. James Jr. carefully rewound the watch, listening to its soft ticking. All these years, he said quietly, I've been trying to live up to a man I never knew. Trying to be the kind of father he never got to be for me. Tell me about him, he asked Tom, his voice barely a whisper. Tell me everything. And as the morning sun climbed higher over Miller's diner, Tom began to share 60 years of memories, filling in the gaps of a son's heart with stories of his father's courage, kindness, and love, a love that had finally found its way home. The day had stretched into late morning at Miller's diner, the breakfast rush long over. Betty had rearranged the tables, creating a makeshift gathering space for Tom, James Jr., and the other bikers. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the aroma of apple pie she'd just pulled from the oven. Your father loved apple pie, Tom said, smiling at a memory. Used to trade his cigarette rations for an extra slice whenever we got them. He watched as James Jr. took a bite, seeing the same look of appreciation cross his face that he'd seen on his friends so many years ago. The other bikers had introduced themselves properly by now. The white-haired one was Frank, a Vietnam veteran. The others, Dave, Mike, and Steve, were younger, Gulf War veterans who'd found brotherhood in their motorcycle group. Each had their own story, their own reasons for finding family on the open road. You run a veteran support group? Tom asked, genuinely curious about the man James Jr. had become. James Jr. nodded, setting down his fork. Started small, just a few of us meeting in a church basement. Now we've got chapters in 3 states. We help veterans' kids get to college, find jobs, deal with losing a parent in service. He paused, looking at the watch that now lay between them on the table. Guess I was trying to give other kids what I never had. Your old man would have loved that, Tom said softly. He was always looking out for the younger soldiers, especially the ones with families back home. Frank leaned forward, his weathered face thoughtful. Jim never told us why he started the support group. Just threw himself into it, worked harder than anyone. Now I understand, he was doing for others what nobody could do for him. Tom pulled out his wallet and carefully extracted an old, folded photograph. This was your father's unit, he said, spreading it on the table. That's him there, front row, second from left. Always had that same serious look until somebody cracked a joke. James Jr. stared at the photo hungrily, memorizing every detail of his father's face. The other bikers gathered around, seeing their leader's father for the first time. The resemblance was striking, the same strong jaw, the same way of holding themselves. He wrote to your mother every day, Tom continued. Carried your picture right here, over his heart. Said it gave him courage, knowing he had someone to come home to. Betty quietly placed another pot of coffee on the table, wiping away a tear as she listened. She'd known Tom for 20 years, served him breakfast nearly every morning, but had never heard these stories. We've got a scholarship program, James Jr. said suddenly. For kids who've lost parents in service. Every year, we help a dozen kids go to college. He looked up at Tom. Would you consider being on the selection committee? Help us choose the recipients? Tom's eyes brightened. Frank leaned forward, his weathered face thoughtful. Jim never told us why he started the support group. Just threw himself into it, worked harder than anyone. Now I understand, he was doing for others what nobody could do for him. Tom pulled out his wallet and carefully extracted an old, folded photograph. This was your father's unit, he said, spreading it on the table. That's him there, front row, second from left. Always had that same serious look until somebody cracked a joke. James Jr. stared at the photo hungrily, memorizing every detail of his father's face. The other bikers gathered around, seeing their leader's father for the first time. The resemblance was striking, the same strong jaw, the same way of holding themselves. He wrote to your mother every day, Tom continued. Carried your picture right here, over his heart. Said it gave him courage, knowing he had someone to come home to. Betty quietly placed another pot of coffee on the table, wiping away a tear as she listened. She'd known Tom for 20 years, served him breakfast nearly every morning, but had never heard these stories. We've got a scholarship program, James Jr. said suddenly. For kids who've lost parents in service. Every year, we help a dozen kids go to college. He looked up at Tom. Would you consider being on the selection committee? Help us choose the recipients? Tom's eyes brightened. Your father always said education was the key to a better future. He'd be honored to know his son was making that possible for others. The conversation flowed naturally after that, decades of silence giving way to stories, questions, and shared understanding. The bikers shared tales from their own service, their own losses and triumphs. Tom listened, adding his wisdom when needed, seeing how the brotherhood he'd known in war had found new life in peace. As the stories continued, something profound was happening in Miller's diner. The gap between generations was closing, old wounds were healing, and the circle of understanding was growing wider. These men, separated by age and experience but united by service and sacrifice, were building bridges across time itself. And in the middle of it all, a silver pocket watch kept ticking, its steady rhythm a reminder that some connections never truly die, they just wait for the right moment to be rediscovered. Word of what happened at Miller's Diner spread through the small town like wildfire. By early afternoon, Mayor Thompson himself stopped by, ostensibly for his usual coffee, but really to witness the gathering that had everyone talking. The bikers had moved some tables together, creating an impromptu meeting space. Maps were spread out on the tables, showing the routes of their veteran support programs. Tom sat among them, his veteran's cap now joined by several others as more local veterans had drifted in throughout the day. "We've got 15 bikes committed for the scholarship fundraiser next month," James Jr. was explaining, his earlier emotional vulnerability now transformed into purposeful energy. "But we're always looking to expand our reach." Old Bill Wilson, who'd been quietly watching all morning from his counter seat, finally spoke up. "My grandson's a Marine. Lost his best friend in Afghanistan last year. Left behind 2 kids." His voice was gruff with emotion. "Would your program be able to help them?" James Jr. immediately pulled out a notebook, his massive hands surprisingly gentle with the pages. "Give me their information, sir. We'll make sure those kids are taken care of." Tom watched with pride as his friend's son took down the details, seeing how James Sr.'s compassion had found new life in his boy. The diner had become more than just a restaurant, it was now a command center for hope. Sarah Chen, who taught at the local high school, came in for her usual lunch and ended up staying. "We've got several students with parents deployed," she said. "They could really use some mentoring, someone who understands what they're going through." The bikers exchanged looks, a silent communication born of years riding together. Frank nodded, speaking for the group. "We could arrange monthly visits. Our members know what it's like, growing up with a parent serving." Throughout the afternoon, more townspeople came by. Each brought their own stories, their own connections to service and sacrifice. Betty kept the coffee flowing, her usual efficient service now paired with a deeper understanding of each customer's story. Mrs. Johnson from the library arrived with a box of old photographs and documents. "These belonged to veterans from our town," she explained. "Been collecting dust in our archives. Maybe they could help with your historical displays at the support centers." The diner became a hub of activity, with Tom at its heart. He shared more stories of James Sr., each one helping his son understand the legacy he'd been unknowingly carrying forward. The pocket watch lay on the table, its presence a reminder of how one act of keeping a promise had sparked something larger. Mayor Thompson, watching all this unfold, cleared his throat. "The old community center's been sitting empty. With some work, it could make a fine headquarters for your veteran support programs. Right here in town." James Jr. looked surprised, then thoughtful. "We've been wanting to establish a permanent presence in this area," he admitted. "Somewhere between our existing chapters." "Sometimes the right place finds you," Tom said quietly, his wise eyes taking in the scene around him. The diner that had witnessed so many everyday moments over the years was now witnessing something extraordinary, the birth of a new community, one built on understanding, service, and connections that span generations. As evening approached, more bikes could be heard rumbling into town. Word had spread through the veteran motorcycle network, bringing others who wanted to be part of what was happening. The small parking lot filled with motorcycles, their chrome gleaming in the setting sun. The impact of that morning's reunion was rippling outward, touching lives far beyond what anyone could have imagined. In Miller's Diner, over coffee and pie, barriers were coming down, connections were being made, and healing was happening one story at a time. The sun was setting over Miller's Diner, casting long shadows through the windows. Tom Henderson sat in his usual booth, but nothing else about this day had been usual. The diner was still full, humming with conversation and purpose, as 60 years of waiting had transformed into a new beginning. James Jr. sat across from him, the silver pocket watch open on the table between them. They'd spent hours sharing stories, planning for the future, and healing wounds that had been open for far too long. The other bikers were scattered around the diner, some on phones organizing future events, others talking with locals about veterans' needs in the community. "You know," Tom said softly, "your father once told me that the true measure of a life isn't in the years you live, but in what you leave behind." He looked around the diner, at the connections being formed, the promises being made. "He'd be amazed to see what you've built." James Jr. ran his thumb over the watch's worn surface. "All these years, I thought I was missing something, trying to fill a hole I couldn't explain. But it wasn't just about finding my father's watch or learning about him." He looked up at Tom. "It was about understanding that his legacy was already living through me, through every kid we've helped, every family we've supported." Betty brought them fresh coffee, her eyes misty. The diner that had been her workplace for 20 years had become something more today, a place where miracles could happen, where the past could heal the present. Mayor Thompson had returned with preliminary paperwork for the community center. The old building would soon become a hub for veteran support services, a place where the work James Jr. had started could grow stronger roots. Local veterans were already volunteering to help with renovations. "Life has a way of coming full circle," Tom said, watching as another group of bikers arrived outside, their leather vests bearing patches from veteran support groups across the country. "Your father saved my life that day in Korea. Now his son is saving others in his own way." James Jr. stood up, his impressive frame somehow softer now, transformed by the day's events. He carefully picked up the pocket watch, then did something unexpected. He handed it back to Tom. "Keep it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been its guardian for 60 years. It belongs with you." He smiled, a smile so like his father's that Tom's heart ached. "Besides, I don't need a watch to remember him anymore. I see him every time we help a veteran's child, every time we welcome another rider into our family." Tom accepted the watch, understanding the deeper meaning in the gesture. It wasn't just about keeping or returning a treasured object, it was about recognizing that some legacies don't need physical reminders. They live on in the actions we take, the lives we touch, the differences we make. As the day's last light faded, Tom looked around Miller's diner one more time. The place would never be the same, it had become a symbol of how love could transcend time, how promises kept could change lives, and how the bonds between soldiers could stretch across generations. "Your father once said time would bring him home," Tom said quietly. "He kept that promise today, through you." Outside, the rumble of motorcycles mixed with the evening breeze, carrying with it the sound of new beginnings. In Miller's diner, over endless cups of coffee and countless shared stories, a 60-year journey had ended, but an even greater one was just beginning. Some said it was just coincidence that brought 5 bikers to a small-town diner that morning. Others called it fate. But for those who were there, who witnessed the power of a promise kept and a legacy revealed, it was something more, a reminder that in this world of rush and chaos, taking time to honor the past could create miracles in the present. And every morning after that, when Tom Henderson sat in his usual booth at Miller's diner, he wasn't just a 96-year-old veteran anymore. He was a guardian of stories, a keeper of promises, and a living bridge between the past and the future, proof that some promises are worth waiting a lifetime to keep.